Welcome back to my presentation series of Microsoft Excel titled A Researcher's Basic Guide. This is part 2, which will focus on data analysis using Microsoft Excel. This is part 2 of a 3 presentation series. So if you are not familiar with Microsoft Excel, please make sure to watch part 1 of the presentation series, which explains some of the basic concepts and terms used in Microsoft Excel. This will help you to follow with ease. At the end of this presentation, I would expect one to be able to perform basic data cleaning using Microsoft Excel functions, be able to perform basic data analysis using Excel built-in function and your own custom functions, and to be able to perform analysis of variance, and finally be able to use and create pivot tables. The dataset that will be used as an example in this presentation was obtained from the ECDC website. To obtain the full dataset, please feel free to follow the link below. The link will also be provided in the description box. The dataset is about weekly COVID-19 cases for all the countries in the world from the first week of 2020 to the second week of 2021. This is how the data set looks like. In the first row, we have variable names. For example, country, country code, continent, population, indicator, weekly count, year, week, and so on. One of the first steps in data analysis is data cleaning. Data cleaning involves removing or modifying the data that is irrelevant, incomplete, duplicated, or improperly formatted. So one of the first steps that I want to do here is to just expand the columns so that we will be able to see the variable names clearly. You expand the columns by just dragging the cursor to the right. So now we can see all the variable names. Then we can see that there are variables that we will not be interested in using. For example, country code, we are not interested in using because the country variable tells us enough information. So we can just remove the variable country code by right-clicking and navigating to delete. Also, the source. We already acknowledged the source of the data in the reference sheet. So this we can delete. We can just drag this so that the cumulative count name does not overlap to another column. So what we can do now is the data set is still very big. And let's say, for example, we're only interested in working with COVID cases for South Africa. What we will do is we'll filter out the countries that we are not interested in working with. So to do that, we just highlight the first column and navigate to the data tab. Then you go and select the filter icon. Then immediately when you select that, a drop-down option will appear in the variable country. You click on that, then you see that all the countries in the world, which are about 195 countries, are selected. That is a lot of countries for us to work with. So as mentioned, we are interested in analyzing the data for COVID-19 cases for South Africa. So we will just deselect all the countries and search for the country or for the variable that you want to analyze. Here I will just type South Africa. Then we see that there are a number of even other countries are highlighted. We just deselect them and we are only left with South Africa. Then when you click OK, then you'll see now only South Africa is left in the country variable. We can also see that like now our spreadsheet filtered out a number of observations. So out of 20,652 records, we're only working with 92 records. For beginners to become highly proficient in Microsoft Excel, they must master basic Excel formulas and functions. There are two basic ways to perform calculations in an Excel spreadsheet, that is, by either using formulas or functions. Formulas are custom expressions that operate on a range of cells, and functions are predefined formulas in Excel. They are friendly to use. Some of the functions include the sum function, average function, median, mean, and so on. I'll give an example of how to use these functions in an Excel spreadsheet in a moment. There are 5 ways of inserting a formula inside a cell, but I will only focus on one method. That is by typing a formula in an empty cell or in the formula bar. This process usually starts by typing an equal to sign followed by the name of the function. If you do not type the equal to sign, you will get an error. As an example, if you want to calculate weekly COVID cases in South Africa from the first week of 2020 till the second week of 2021, we will use the function sum. You start by typing equals to followed by the name of the function, which is sum. Excel is so intelligent in such a way that the moment you start typing the name of the function, a pop-up hint window will open, showing you all other functions that are related or that have the same name as the one that you are typing. So what you just have to do is navigate to the relevant function. In our case, which is sum, you double click on that. Please do not use enter, as that will result in an error. Instead of using an enter, you can use tab. After selecting the function, you will now need to highlight a cell range where the values that you want to add are located. In our example, our cell range is A2 till A93. So I'll just put my cursor in the cell A2 and drag down until A93. Then now you can press enter. We can press enter. Then we can see that the total number of COVID cases in South Africa from the first week of 2020 to the second week of 2021 is 1,375,031 cases. So just to recap on how functions work, you must initially type equals to in any empty cell where you want your output to be displayed. Then you type the name of the function. Let's say we still want to use sum. You type sum. Then you double click on the name of the function. Then highlight a cell range of the values that you want to manipulate. We will now continue exploring some of the functions in Excel. The round function in Excel rounds a number to a specified number of digits. For example, if we want to round the number in cell A3 to have 3 digits after the comma, we can either use the round up, round down, or round up functions. To do so, remember that for every function, you need to start by typing equals to, type the name of the function, navigate to the function name, double click, and here the pop-up window tells us that the input that we need to put for this function is the number that we want to round and the number of digits. So I will select the number that I want to round and divide the inputs with a semicolon, then type the number of digits that I want after the comma. Let's say we want 2. Enter. The round down function works exactly the same as the round function, except that the round down function rounds towards 0 and round up rounds away from 0. For example, if we still want to round the same number to have this 3 digits after the comma, we'll just say round down, select the number, divide the input with a semicolon, write the number of digits that we want after comma, then enter. We see here our output is 0.085. And if we want to round up the number now, we'll use the same digits. Now we say round up, select the number, separate the inputs with a semicolon, 3, enter. We can see like that the difference here is that here with round down, we have the last digit as 5 and the last digits for round up, it's 6. The function work the same. So basically all these functions in Excel follow the same principle. You start by typing equal to, you write the name of the function, double click on the pop-up window, select the relevant function, and also read the pop-up window for hints on what inputs you should put for your function. The count function counts the number of cells that contains numerical values. For example, if we want to know the number of cells for the population variable that has values, we will have to use the count variable. And remember that for every function, you start with equals to, count, double click on count, and highlight the cell range. Then enter. Then it tells us all the cells for the population variable has values. However, if you want to count the number of cells for a variable that has character variables, you will have to use the function COUNTA. For example, for the continent variable, if we want to know how many cells has values, we will use COUNTA and also select the cell range. Enter. Then it also tells us that all the cells for continent has values. If you want to calculate or determine the number of cells that has values for both numerical and character variables, you will have to use the function COUNTA. For example, if we want to know how many cells for these two variables has values, we'll just highlight the two columns, select enter, then we'll see that it's 184. To determine the average number of weekly COVID-19 cases for South Africa from the first week of 2020 to the second week of 2021, you will use the average function, which is average. Double-click on average, then highlight the cell range of where you want to determine the average. Then press enter. Then from this we can see that on average there are about 14,945 cases per week in South Africa for the period to determine the average number of weekly COVID-19 cases for South Africa. You will need to use the average function, which is equals to average. Double click on average and highlight your cell range. Then press enter. We can see that on average we have about 14,945 COVID-19 cases per week. The median of a data set is the most middle value when the data or the variable values are arranged in increasing order. So the median of the weekly COVID cases count is equals to median. Then we see that the parameter values of the function median, it's the cell range. Then select enter. For this example, the median value is 1,420. If we want to determine whether the cumulative weekly COVID cases is greater than the weekly count, we will use the if function. The if function brings logic into Excel. The function is used to test whether a condition is met, and if it's met, it will return a value, and if it is not met, it will return another value such as false. If, then the moment you type if, the pop-up window opens and explains to you what the if function does. Here it says that if checks whether a condition is met and returns one value if true and another value if false. So we just double click on that, and as soon as you double click on the function, it will tell you what parameter values are needed. So here it says first you must put the logical test, that is the condition. Then the second parameter is you put a value that should be returned if the condition is met, and the third value, you put the value that will be returned if the condition is not true. So for example, if we want to determine whether the cumulative weekly count cases is greater than the weekly cases, then what we'll do is we select the cumulative count, then greater than, then weekly cases. We divide our parameters by semicolon, and we want, if the condition is met, we want Excel to tell us that it's true. Then we write true. Then if the condition is not met, we would want Excel to return false. Then when you press enter, you see that it is false because 3 is equals to 3. It's not greater than 3. If you drag down this column, you'll see that it will also check the condition for all the other cells. The COUNTIF function in Excel works exactly the same way as the if function, but the COUNTIF function returns the number of cells that meet a particular criteria. For example, if we want to know that in our study period, how many weeks more than 1,000 COVID cases were recorded, we will use the COUNTIF function. Then we see that the parameters that are required for the function is the cell range and the criteria. So our cell range is the weekly count of COVID cases. Our criteria is more than 1,000. Then we separate the parameters with a semicolon, and please remember that always your criteria must be in quotation marks. Then we can see that in our study period, we had 51 weeks where more than 1,000 weekly count of COVID cases were recorded. By now, you should be comfortable in using Excel functions. I will do 3 more examples. If you want to determine the standard deviation of weekly COVID cases, you'll just still follow the same procedure. Start by typing equals to, then the formula for standard deviation in Excel is STDEV. Then you either select whether you use a population or sample standard deviation. Then we are using a sample standard deviation, and we see that the parameters that are needed, it's just the cell range. Enter, then we see that the standard deviation is 27,391 cases. And also, if you want to determine the minimum number of weekly COVID cases that were recorded for South Africa, you will just follow the same procedure, equals to, the formula to determine the minimum value is mean. Double click, then the same thing, the formula tells you what the parameters are, then you just highlight the range of the cells where you want to determine the minimum, and enter. Then we see that the minimum value ever recorded for weekly COVID cases is 0. Then if you want to determine the maximum, you follow the same procedure. The formula for maximum is max. Highlight the cell range. Enter. Then we see that the maximum number of cases that were recorded per week during our study period is 130,800. If we want to test if the means of two or more groups are significantly different from one another, then we will use an ANOVA test. For example, if we want to compare the weekly average count of a study period 2021 to 2022 and the weekly average count of the study period 2020 to 2021, we will compare them using an ANOVA test. So the first thing that we do, let's predict the weekly count for 2021 to 2022. So if we assume that the weekly count for the study period 2021 to 2022 increases by 20%, of which this is just an assumption, it's not true, because our government has put in so many measures to curb the spread of COVID. So to predict these values, we would say we assume that for each week in the previous study period, the cases now increase by 20%. This fact plus A3 again, A2 again, multiplied by 20%, multiplied by 0.2. Okay, then sometimes you might get an error. Then when you get an error, please just read what the problem is and try to fix it. So for me here, the error is that I use a full stop instead of a comma. Then we see that the weekly cell count or the weekly count will be 3.6. Then to calculate for the rest of the cells, you just need to drag down until the last cell. So one other thing that we can just round everything to be whole numbers. Let's say we do not want the numbers to have any decimal point. So another way to round this, it's just by formatting cells. You right click and you navigate to format cells. Then you go to number. Then here on your right hand side, it says decimal place. So for us, we do not want any numbers after the decimal place. So we'll just put 0. Then now we can see that all the numbers are rounded up. So here what I've just shown you is how to create your own custom function and another method for rounding of your numbers or for formatting your cells. So now what we'll do is we will now perform an analysis of variance by just saying, now that we have created the variables that we want to perform an analysis of variance for, to do so, it is very easy and simple in Excel. What you just have to do is navigate to the Data tab, then go to the group for data analysis, and a pop-up window with data analysis tools will show up where it has so many analysis tools. For us, we are interested in analysis of variance. There are a number of options for analysis of variance. I will not get into the logistics of that, but for us now, we're only interested in the single factor one. You just click OK, then you have to select your input range. So for us, we want it's A2 until A93, which is A2 to B93, which is already selected. You click OK. Then this output will show. The calculations are done for you in Excel. So what you just have to do now is to interpret. For now, for example, we see that the p-value is greater than 0.05, which means that the means are equal, or rather the means do not differ significantly from each other. Pivot tables are used in Excel to help analyze data so much easily, especially when you have a large data set. They are used to sort, summarize, reorganize, count, obtain a total or average, or sort data in a table. To insert a pivot table, you can highlight the variables that you want to create a table for. Then you go to insert, then you say insert pivot table. Then it'll give you an option of selecting a table range. Then you can just say OK. Then here we can see that there are pivot table fields. We have country and continent. Then below we have filters, where you can filter the continent or particular countries that you want to work with. So we have rows, we have values. So we can drag the country because we want the country to appear as a row. Then we want the continent to appear in the columns. Pivot tables are used in Excel to help analyze the data very quickly, especially when you have large data sets. Pivot tables can be used to sort, summarize, reorganize, to obtain count, total, sum, or even averages of a data set. To obtain a pivot table, you must firstly highlight your variables or your cell range, then navigate to insert, then you have pivot table, and you also have another option for recommended pivot table. We can start with the pivot table. So you already see that it has already selected the cell range. You can say click on OK. Then we see now that we have our variables here, and we also have filters, columns, rows, and values. Here you can choose the type of output that you want in your pivot table. For example, let's say we want summaries of weekly COVID cases by country. So on our rows, we want the country variable. We can already see that all the countries appear on the row labels. Then in our columns, we want the weekly count. So what now we have is the total sum of all the weekly counts for all the countries. You can also change the kind of indicators or of the variables that you want. You can just play around with the variables and see the type of output that you get. So if, for example, on the rows we want the continent, and we also want the weekly COVID cases per continent, we'll click the weekly COVID cases. as the values. Then now we have a summary of the weekly COVID-19 cases per continent from the beginning of our study period to the second week of 2021. As I have mentioned, there are two options of obtaining pivot tables. The other option, you can just go to Insert, you go to Recommended Pivot Tables. This already has done all the work for you. Then you'll just select the table that you want. For example, the first table tells us the sum of weekly count by continent, and we have already done it manually. So I think it is nice that now you'll be able to do it manually, or you can either just choose the recommended option. And also we have sum of weekly COVID cases by country and indicator, or otherwise you can just have the summary of the total sum of weekly COVID cases per indicator. Please be on the lookout for part 3 of the Excel presentation. In part 3, we will just focus on drawing graphs.